In chapter 7, we talk about emotions and how our emotions affect our communications and our relationships. So, the first topic that we'll get into is emotional intelligence. And this is the ability to recognize what we're feeling, to be able to recognize what someone else is feeling, and then to be able to use those emotions appropriately in the right ways, in the most effective ways. So it's basically just kind of this overall idea of how good someone is at expressing their own emotions or interpreting the emotions of someone else, and then being able to um, in appropriate ways. You probably have known some people that just seem like they just don't get it when you're having an emotional conversation. And some people are better than others at this emotional intelligence, but it's definitely something that you can learn. So it's what we're going to be talking about in this chapter. So there are four different ways to view emotions, kind of from social science point of view, different ways of viewing how emotions come to be or how we learn to recognize our emotions. So the first one is the organismic view of emotions, and this one is just mostly focused on the physical response. So something happens in our environment, which is the stimulus. So for these examples, we'll give the example of a barking dog. So I think there's something in the textbook about a barking dog as they're explaining one of these points of view. So we'll use that for this lecture to explain these different views of how we look at emotions. So say the stimulus is the barking dog. Then we have a physiological response, which is something happening with our own body. So that might be your heart rate goes up. So then based on that physiological response, then we decide what the emotion is. So dog barks, my heart rate goes up. That must mean I'm scared. So the emotion that we decide it's going to be is fear, just based on what's happening to your body. And that is the organismic view. Then the next one is the perceptual view. And this is more about how we see the situation. So we've talked about perception in an earlier chapter. So perception is kind of just your own view or how you're going to interpret a situation. So external event is the dog barking. Then how do you view that? Do you like dogs? Do you not like dogs? Whatever you decide based on your perception is going to help you interpret what emotion that you feel. So if you are afraid of dogs generally and this dog comes at you barking, then you're going to see that through your perspective as a scary situation, and then the response again would be fear. The next one is cognitive labeling, and this one has to do with the language that you're using. It's all about the words that you choose to use to describe the situation. So you have the external event, which is the dog barking, then the physiological response, again, the same as the first one, would be, okay, my heart rate increased. I can feel my heart pounding in my chest. But then what is my label? What words am I going to use to describe that? Well, I'm afraid of dogs, so I'm going to say, this dog is scary. And so then my emotion is fear. If you have a different cognitive labeling, so you use different words to describe it, you might say, wow, that dog surprised me. So then the emotion changes from fear to surprise. So that's the little discussion in the textbook about the way that you label a situation can help determine what emotions come out of it. And then the last one is the interactive view, which basically says that society helps to shape how we view our situations and what emotions will come from a situation based on what society says is appropriate or what cultural experiences we've had in the past, and that helps to shape how we feel about situations. So we're going to talk about this some more on the next slide. These social influences on emotion. So the first one is framing rules. Framing rules are what your culture or your society says is okay to feel in certain situations. So I'll give the example of a funeral. So in American culture, funerals are typically very sad occasions. So it's okay to cry at a funeral because that's what our society says. This is a sad time. Someone's just died. It's okay to feel sad. In other cultures, however, they view a funeral as more of a celebration of that person's life. and it's not really seen as a sad event. So it would be okay to be happy and telling funny stories about the person and to feel like a celebration of that person's life at a funeral in some other cultures. So framing rules just tell you kind of what is socially acceptable to be feeling at certain times. And then feeling rules is similar. It's basically kind of what do you have the right to feel? So, someone will say you have every right to be angry about that. That would be a feeling rule. So in some situations, you might say, yes, you have every right to be angry. In others, you might say, that really wasn't her fault. That maybe you don't have the right to be angry at that person. So that would be a feeling rule of giving someone the right to feel something. So we'll talk about deep acting and surface acting. When our emotional response maybe isn't an acceptable one, maybe we realize I shouldn't be feeling this way, then we kind of have these two different responses of how we can decide to either change that emotion or to change our response to it. And this is called emotion work. So the first one is deep acting. So if I realize I really should not feel angry at this person, it's not their fault, then deep acting would be to try to change the actual emotion. Like I'm trying to not be angry anymore. I'm deciding, okay, that was not appropriate for me to feel angry, so I'm going to try to change that anger into something else. Surface acting is I still feel angry inside, but I just change my outward expression. So instead of yelling at that person, I might still talk to them in a nice way and try to stay calm on the surface. But what I'm still really feeling is anger. So deep acting is changing the actual emotion, and surface acting is just changing what is portrayed on the surface. It doesn't really change the emotion itself. And those are both examples of emotion work. So emotion work is just when you're feeling something that you either don't want to be feeling or is not an appropriate emotion, then you work to try to change those emotions within yourself. Sometimes it's not always acceptable or appropriate to express our emotions. So we might be feeling angry, but it might not always be the best idea to tell everybody about it or to express that emotion. So some reasons, some obstacles to expressing emotions, reasons why we might not express our emotions would be these four. So the first one is cultural and social expectations. So I think it's pretty common, especially in American society, for men to feel like they have to be tough. And that's kind of starting to change a little bit. And it's definitely kind of a stereotypical thing to say, oh, a man shouldn't cry. A man needs to, toughen up. And parents will tell their little boys, don't be a crybaby or something like that. So then men get this idea that it's inappropriate to express sadness. So that's a cultural expectation. Whether that's right or wrong, it, obviously depends on the situation, and men shouldn't feel that way, but they do because that's a pressure that society has put on them. Self-protection is just like what it sounds like. You're just trying to protect yourself from a situation. So an example of this might be if you're at work and you're really angry at your boss. Well, if you don't want to, look bad in front of the boss, or you're trying to protect your job or something like that, then you should not express that emotion in that situation. So sometimes it's best to not express an emotion if it's going to end up harming you in some way. So self-protection could be a reason why you wouldn't express an emotion. And then on the other side of that is protecting someone else. So sometimes people will say, well, I didn't tell you because I didn't want to hurt your feelings. So that would be an example of trying to protect someone else, because sometimes our emotions can be hurtful to other people. We might not want to hurt someone, so we're not going to share that emotion because we know it would hurt someone. And then the last one is social and professional roles. So this would be, for example, on your job. Sometimes it's not appropriate to express an emotion when you're in a professional role. So for example, a doctor might feel very sad that one of their patients has died, or, trying to explain to the family that the person has passed away. They might feel really sad inside, but it's not appropriate for the doctor to be crying, when they're trying to tell the family, because their professional role says, okay, I need to state the facts here. I need to be professional. I need to not get overly emotional. So that would be another example of when it might not be appropriate to express an emotion. So some ineffective ways of expressing emotion, these would be ways that are not very emotionally intelligent. The first one would be speaking in generalities. So if someone asks you, how are you doing today? You might say, oh, I'm fine. Well, that would be a generality because fine is so broad. Like, what does that even mean? Like, I'm happy, I'm excited, I'm tired. What does that even mean? So it's a little bit better to be more specific when you're talking about an emotion, trying to acknowledge more specifically exactly what it is that you're feeling. So instead of saying, I'm fine, you could say, like, oh, I'm so happy today, and it's because I am excited about the date I'm going on tonight, or it's because my mom is coming into town, or, whatever the more specific emotion is. The next one is not owning your feelings. So we've talked a little bit before about I language and you language. So when we use you language to express our own emotions, we're kind of giving our power to someone else. So it would be like saying, I'm angry versus saying, you made me mad. So when we use that you language, it's giving all of the power over my own emotions to someone else. Like I don't have control over how I feel, which is not true. I do. So if I'm angry, I should say, I feel angry instead of saying, you made me so mad. So just making sure that you're owning your own feelings and that you realize that you do have control over the emotions that you feel and the emotions that you decide to share with others. And then the last one that's ineffective is counterfeit emotional language. This is kind of similar to the generalities, but it's more of just kind of labeling it with the wrong thing. So if you're feeling angry, but you tell someone like, oh, I'm just tired, then that's obviously you're not really getting to the true emotion. So another example would be if someone says, just leave me alone. Well, okay, there could be lots of different reasons why you would want someone to leave you alone. Maybe you're stressed out about school and you're just really, really busy and you just don't have time to talk. Well, that would be one thing. Or you're really mad at that person because they hurt your feelings yesterday. Well, that would be a completely different situation. So when you're identifying emotions, just being sure to give the right label to the emotion that you're feeling. And then the last part of the chapter goes into some guidelines, just like every other chapter, helping us to be able to be more emotionally intelligent. So the first one is identifying your emotions, which is what we just talked about, making sure we're giving correct labels to our emotions. So really figuring out kind of what is going on inside and what has happened and what is that making you feel. Are you angry or are you just frustrated at the situation? Or are you frustrated at yourself? There's lots of emotions that can kind of be close to each other. So figuring out exactly which is which. And then deciding when we're going to express an emotion, if that's an appropriate choice. And then if we decide yes, then how are we going to express that? And we go through this little chart here, kind of a flow chart of how that process would work. So first we define what we feel, which emotion is it that I'm feeling. Then we decide, okay, am I going to communicate this to the other person or not? Sometimes it's not appropriate, like we talked about before. If that's the case, then we're going to go into some emotion work and some self-talk and figuring out, okay, well, if it's not appropriate to share, how am I going to deal with these emotions? How am I going to change the way I'm feeling so that I'm not angry all the time or that I'm not sad anymore? And it's going through that emotion work of trying to learn how to deal with that emotion on your own. If you decide, yes, I am going to share this emotion, I am going to communicate it, then you've got to decide, okay, who am I going to talk to about? When am I going to talk to them? Where am I going to talk to them? I'm really planning out a more thoughtful conversation instead of just blowing up at somebody right in the moment. And then the next guidelines would be how we go about having that conversation. Owning your feelings, using the I talk instead of the you. Monitoring your self-talk is important in emotions. So self-talk is that kind of running dialogue in your head of what you're telling yourself. So if you're constantly saying, I'm not good enough, I'm just a failure, and you're constantly just down, 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 then your emotion based on your self-talk is going to be more negative and more sad or disappointed or whatever. But if you can kind of talk yourself about the positive things and try to remember the positive things and bring out more positive statements, then that can help to change your emotion. Adopting a rational emotive approach, we're going to talk about that on the next slide, but it's basically just kind of this approach to how you're going to have an emotional conversation or how you deal with those emotions. And then responding sensitively when others communicate emotions. So a lot of this chapter and this lecture has focused on ourselves and how we deal with emotions and how we're going to communicate emotions. But part of emotional intelligence is also being able to interpret someone else's emotions and to respond appropriately. So when someone comes to us with an emotion, it's really important to be sensitive to that emotion. So I think it's pretty easy to kind of dismiss people, and maybe someone comes to us and says, I'm really sad about something. And maybe your first reaction would be to say, oh, you shouldn't feel sad, or don't feel that way, or say, don't cry, or, something like that. Or you'll get over it. It'll be okay. When it's actually really important to validate that person's emotions and to let them know that you understand where they're coming from. Just to not just dismiss it and move on, to say, I understand that you're feeling away. Why don't you tell me more about the situation? And then let them it's okay for them to feel that emotion. Okay, so the rational emotive approach is what we just talked about on the last slide. So here are the steps to this approach. So the first is to monitor your emotional reactions. So I'm going to use the example of someone being nervous around their boss. Okay, so the first step is I'm going to monitor what happens. So it's those physiological responses that we talked about before in that first viewpoint of emotion. So maybe your hands start trembling, or your palms get sweaty, or your heartbeat increases. You start to, your heart starts pounding in your chest, or your throat is dry, or something like that. So you're going to monitor all of those things that are happening and realize you're going to give that emotion a name. Okay, it's nervousness. The next step is to identify commonalities in events of when that happens to you. So, okay, I felt nervousness, which was coming from shaking hands, sweaty palms, heart rate going up, all of those things. I felt that nervousness when I was around my boss. But I also felt the same way when I got pulled over by a policeman. And I also felt the same way when I met my future in-laws for the first time. So you're starting to realize, okay, there's a pattern of when I'm feeling this nervous feeling, and it's every time there's an authority figure around. Maybe I felt that way when I had to go talk to my professor about my grade or something like that. I felt nervous. Every time I'm with an authority figure, I feel nervous. So you realize that there's a pattern. So then the third step is to tune into your self-talk and then noticing those irrational beliefs and fallacies. So maybe you feel nervous and then you start telling yourself, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm terrible at my job. I'm probably going to get fired right now. That's why I'm feeling nervous around my boss. Which all of those things are those fallacies that we've talked about before in kind of overgeneralizing, like the end of the world just because this one situation happened. So I feel like every time I talk to my boss, I'm the worst employee in the company and I'm going to get fired. Well, then we go to step 4, which is using that self-talk to dispute those fallacies. So when you catch yourself having all of those negative thoughts, you can then kind of say to yourself, hold on a second, I'm not the worst employee in the company. I've done some good things, and try to remember the positive things that you've done. And my boss probably isn't going to fire me, and have more of a positive dialogue in your head. So when we go through this rational emotive approach, it kind of helps balance, because a lot of times we just jump into this like emotional response to something, and it might not always be the right way to handle it. So when we pull in a little more logic and realize, okay, I need to calm down, I need to think this through, then we can have a more productive approach. So this chapter was just important because we all have emotions and we all need to work on our emotional intelligence, whatever level we're at right now. We can always do better about expressing our emotions in a healthy way and being able to interpret those emotions from other people. So that's chapter 7. Let me know if you have any questions.